Hello everyone, this is Frodan back with another core skills video on all the fundamental skills that you need to climb TFT on any patch. Now, before we start, I want to re-emphasize once again, if this is the first video you watch in the series, that this guide is not for teaching the basics of TFT. You should know how to make items, you should know how augments work, you should know how to level and refresh your shops, you should understand how gold works in terms of income and streaks and PvE. You should understand the different damage types, like what is physical damage versus magic damage, what is true damage. These are all like things that you'll learn about the game. Like, we're not here to teach a tutorial. And you also need to know how to navigate the carousel, because I'll be referencing a lot of these different concepts. All right, so today's core pillar to climb is items. We talked about gold management before, but without proper item management, your units won't actually do anything. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Today's topics that we're going to talk about for the items are the 3 golden rules of items that every player needs to know. And it's going to be a building block of how we talk about the rest of this video. The second is the concept of item economy. And that is a term that a lot of players don't really understand until they start hearing like high-level players talk about it, or content creators or streamers discuss the concept of item economy. And the last major pillar that we're talking about today within items will be the hidden item formula, which is a bunch of math, but I'm going to try to simplify it as much as you can so that way it becomes approachable. The first thing I want to say about the 3 golden rules is that they basically all summarize in one sentence, which is play your items. Play your items so that way you can actually get value off of them. If you don't play your items and they're on the bench, they're not going to be doing anything. Items are the single greatest multiplier effect that you can have on a unit's combat strength. It's usually more than a combat augment. It's usually more than a trait. It's because the raw power of an item usually gives you stats that you can multiply off of. In general, for the concept of items, you're always trying to multiply your units as opposed to having addition. If you just have 1 plus 2 plus 1 plus 2 plus 1, it's a lot worse than when you're able to get those 2x multipliers, and they become very, very powerful. Items also multiply off of themselves, so you want to stack them. It's much better for one unit to be holding 3 items as opposed to spreading it out. One common mistake that I see at a lot of lower elos, and I want to say somewhere around gold to platinum and even emerald, is that there's a lot of like random one items spread out. And because to them, they see the guides, they say, oh, this unit wants to hold a specific item like a Morelnomicon, but that unit has no other items. And so it's better if you actually put that Morelnomicon on a unit that isn't necessarily supposed to end with it, but you get more items multiplying off each other, so that way you get higher base stats. So you want to always be thinking about multiplicative strength as opposed to additive strength. Unless, of course, there's an augment that says that you should be doing that. In the future, there might be an augment that says spread out your items, or your units can only hold 1 item. That's a rare exception. And this goes back to what I was saying before. Items have 0 impact if they're left on your bench. There's a concept that we say in TFT called slamming. Slamming just basically means making items as you get them as fast as you can, instead of trying to greed and hold out for what the guide recommends, best in slot, aka BIS. So the first question that I want to hit you with, just as a fundamentals question, if I'm coaching you, is I always ask, is it worth greeding for something 10% better, but it costs you 10 health? If the best in slot item is, say, a Bloodthirster, are you willing to make that Bloodthirster if the item said minus 10 HP onto your little legend? And the answer a lot of times is no. And that also would be the case with gold, because a lot of times costing HP can also cause gold, which is going back to what we talked about in the previous video with econ management. If every item you slam was minus 10 HP, you would probably die and lose a lot of placements for it. And this is a question we're going to revisit later in this video as well. And the image that I have, just because some people are visual learners. Okay, I didn't play World of Warcraft, so I'm going to look like a poser, but this is apparently one of the rarest item sets ever back in the old school days. I think it's like a paladin equipment thing. The whole point I'm trying to say is that if you have all these cool, sick items, you would never go into a raid without gear. You don't want to go into battle without your items in TFT. Very similar concept. Okay, so what are the 3 golden rules for items? Golden rule number 1, always prioritize 3 items on a tank and 3 items on a carry. This is probably the most important rule to remember when you're first getting started. A lot of people will think about making 3 items to their backline, and then they play another unit on their board, and they say, oh, I'll just make more items for it. I was told for the second golden rule to build these items, and they just completely ignore their tank. If you don't have a tank, you're not going to have anyone to run defense for your carry, and they're just going to die immediately. And so you're going to lose all your damage, and you're going to lose all your front line. So you always want to try to prioritize first 3 full items on the tank, and 3 full items. And just for clarification, items are combined crafted items as opposed to like a single component. And you're going to get around 12 to 13 guaranteed components at least. There's a little bit exceptions to that, again, depending on the encounter. But this ties into the concept of item economy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The second golden rule is that you generally always want to have utility. The main forms of utility are burning and wounding and penetration for resistances. Wounding and burning are often something that people summarize as a concept called anti-heal. Wounding is specifically to stop people from healing and being their win condition to out-heal your damage. And that actually happens specifically a lot on melee carries. You know, units that attack a lot. Historically, this has been carries, like one of the most iconic melee carries in all of TFT is Warwick. Warwick in any other set is usually like a guy that attacks a lot, and then as he attacks, he heals a lot. And so if you have melee carries with a bunch of bloodthirsters and other things like that to heal up, I'm trying to speak very generically in case this is not relevant for a future set. You want to have that anti-heal so that way they don't stat check you with healing infinite. As of right now, as of January 2026, the 3 forms of anti-heal that you mostly build are red buff, Morellonomicon, and a Sunfire Cape. And they usually go, red buff usually goes on attack damage carry, Morellonomicon usually goes on a magic carry, and Sunfire usually goes on a tank. The other concept is burning, and that's not the same as wounding. Burning is a way for you to deal with incredibly high HP tanks, where they have, because it deals a max % health damage, and it's usually dealt as true damage. And it's really important because in late stages of the game, it's a way for you to set to prevent inevitability from dealing with you. Because some people might just have so much HP that you can't actually reasonably chip at it. So burn is a way to keep that in check. And you don't actually have to remember this because, you know, most of TFT items, they actually burn and wound. It's like written on every item. Red buff says burn and wound. Sunfire says burn and wound. Morellonomicon says burn and wound. So you usually get both. But there are cases where you separate them. And it's really strong versus high HP tag. And it's really good with AoE because you hit the whole board and you burn the whole board. And it's a big source of damage late game. And then the second part of this is penetration, which is what we call sundering and shredding. In the late game, in general, the reason why this is much more important is because one single DPS item is actually not as efficient as reducing their resistances. If you get something that gives you, 30% damage amp, that's not necessarily as effective as reducing the resistances by 30% because that tank becomes 30% less effective in tanking, and you also have multiple sources of damage that potentially hit it. So you actually scale way more by shredding. This also has to do with another concept that we'll probably talk about in a future video of more advanced concepts of reducing resistances with flat and percentage shredding, but don't worry about it. Basically, the summary is just try to get 1% resistance reduction. So either Last Whisper or either Even Shroud. They do not stack if you get them with each other. That's a common mistake that I see a lot of mid-level players doing, which is they say, oh, I have Last Whisper and Sunder. Oh my God, they're going to have no armor. That's not how it works. It only stacks if it's flat reduction, which we'll try to discuss a little bit later on as well. And then finally, the golden rule number 3 is that right now in TFT, you must look for a duo carry late game. A duo carry is much preferred to a duo tank, unless the composition, of course, specifically looks for it. But that's just because of the way that TFT has been designed into, and also because it's way more fun. So a lot of times when people are thinking about items in the late game, you should be thinking about how can I have a secondary source of damage? Because in TFT, it's just very rare to have a solo hyper carry. In the current set, there's a hyper carry called Aurelian Soul, but that's like the exception and not the rule. And you'll know when you see a hyper carry, and it'll take over the meta, and then we'll be like, oh my God, this hyper carry is crazy. But you in general always look for a duo carry late game. And there's a cute Poro. Don't do it alone. Okay, so those are the 3 golden rules. Let's move on to our second pillar, which is item economy. So let's first define item economy for people who have never heard of what the item economy concept is. Item economy is the idea of managing the limited number of item components that you will get dropped during the first few stages of the game. On average, you're going to receive between 11 and 15. I know I said 12 to 13 before, but I looked into it, and technically there are different numbers depending on the encounters. So I just wanted to be more specific about it, and that might change depending on how the game develops. But the most important concept is not about the number of components you get dropped, but specifically the item components that you start with. That's also most important because the first few components you get in the game are the most important. The first gold you make in the game is also the most important. And I do want to clarify that if you don't get an item, let's say you're like, oh, I was told I would get 3 components or 5 components. Sometimes you just get gold instead, and we refer to that in TFT as a gold opener instead of getting items. You can only get 1 component on carousel. You usually get between 2 to 3 per PV rounds, and PV rounds will drop from something called the component bag. These are all just definitions. We're going to explain what this means later on. The component bag is another addendum that we need to define for you guys. A lot of people actually don't even know this, even at a master's and grandmaster's level. I've met a lot of people who actually don't even know this. The first is that the big idea is that there's a metaphorical bag in TFT that has item components. And every time that you're on the PV round, you get an item component orb, you are grabbing into that metaphorical bag. And each stage adds 1 unique component to that bag. So that way you can get multiple of it. So if each metaphorical component bag has rods, tears, bows, swords, gloves, so on and so forth. And when you reach out of it, you have 1 fewer of them. And as such, every successive copy of a component will be harder to obtain because you're more likely to get components that you don't have. And that's important to understand because if you're trying to make a composition or an item set that's dependent on a specific thing, let's say you're trying to make a bunch of tiers, you're less likely to get dropped future tiers with every tier that comes out of the bag. But that's not actually taken from the carousel. The carousel doesn't actually take from that bag. That's a separate instance. And so whatever component you get off of carousel does not actually come out of that component bag, which is why sometimes you end up in the situation. I'm not sure the situation has happened to you. You have a sword, you grab another sword, and then you drop 2 swords. And you just think, how is that even possible? It's because that component on the carousel didn't count for it. This is also why oftentimes BIS is fake, because it's pretty low odds to get the perfect items, even if you greed and drop, going back to the why you should be slamming your items. And here's a little graph. There's like a calculator online that you could use, but essentially, this is what it is visualized with the component grab bag. You just go and drop it. You just go into it, grab a drop. Maybe you get a cloak and you get a belt that's -1, but each stage you get +1 for those components. Okay, so now we know that what item economy is. How do we actually apply this? So here are some crucial concepts at a baseline level that you need to understand about item economy. The first, it's going to sound pretty obvious, but you can only make 1 item from carousel a lot of times. So if you have 3 components, let's say you have a sword, a belt, and a vest, and you're saying, well, I really want this sword to be 1 item, I really want this belt to be another item, and I really want this vest to be another item. But the issue is, you can only complete 1 item from the carousel, even if you are first pick and you get to have your choice of the litter. So a lot of times players will say, well, I'm not going to slam an item because I want this to be half of, like a very classic combo is a Bloodthirster and a Titan's Resolve, because with the sword vest combination. But if you don't slam anything, you're not going to have an item for the entire stage. And this goes back to the previous concept. Put your items in play so that they're in play. So if you're thinking about carousel ahead of time, you only can think about 1 item as opposed to thinking about 2, 3, or even more items than that. I already said this, but I want to drive it home. Your first 2 components shape the game the most. This is what a lot of people call line selection, when they decide what to play based on their first few components in conjunction with their shops and their augments. And that'll be the final core pillar that puts all these fundamentals into place to help you climb, which is the final piece of the puzzle that really maximizes your AVP. But you're going to hear this concept a lot of line selection. The other thing to drive home is that items in general are much harder to permutate and change than units themselves. If you have enough gold, you can always just sell your units and change your board, but it's much harder to change your items unless you have an augment or there's a specific incident that lets you do it. You get dropped a Reforger, or there's an encounter that lets you change your items in some capacity. This is also why a lot of times players will also prioritize the carousel item over the units. A lot of players at low and intermediate levels will prioritize the units a lot on the carousel. But the item, again, you can get those units later, but items are very, very important for how they shape your game plan. And it's a big thing about item economy management, because if you don't take this bow later and you don't get it later on, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, right? So that's why a lot of people prioritize that item. Number 3, it's very important to reduce the number of dead components. There's 2 extremes of item economy. The first is what happens when I have the best case scenario, and then what happens when I have the worst case scenario. And this is something that other players, even at the very highest level, still get wrong, which is that you have to do something with your items as opposed to leave on your bench. Okay, sure, you're playing a magic damage composition, like you want this blue buff, this is a void staff, you want these components, but let's say you get dropped 2 swords. And you're thinking, well, swords is really bad for my composition. I don't really have a lot of application for it. You need to find one. You need to find one. And so the thing about item economy is understanding you're only going to get a certain amount of components from the rest of the game. You have to find something to do with these swords. And so when you watch other people's guides, you watch people's videos or streams, and you're going to say, I have to kill the sword. I have to kill the rod in these compositions. That's often what they're referring to. My example here is if you're playing AD comp, you want swords and gloves, you care a lot less about tears and rods, but you need to use them. So in this case, the way you can use tears and rods in a physical damage composition is building things like Protector's Vow, because that is something that you can play on your tank. And a Crown Guard, which is an item that you can play for your tank. And you're just not going to use these rods outside of maybe one Rage Blade currently, or whatever item that's currently in the meta. And these are just like different tools that you can use in the future. And this might change, right? Again, items are one of the more shifting things that changes every year in TFT. Every year we usually get a couple new items. So hopefully this is still applicable moving forward. But for the most part, this should always be true about every type of damage comp that you have. So then I go back to the original question. Is it worth greeting for 10% better, but it costs you 10 HP? And that's the big question that you should keep coming back to whenever you think about making items. Is it worth greeting for a little bit better items? Because the difference between something like a blue buff versus Shojin is not that big. Sometimes it is, though. Sometimes it is. And that's where expertise comes to climbing. But a lot of times it's not. The other big proponent of item economy is your item prioritization, because what you get dropped off your early items is going to dictate how you are trying to stack your item priority. A big mistake that I see at the mid-level of TFT is that they think every item is equal. They'll pull up TFTAcademy and another website and say, okay, these are the 3 items that's suggested onto a unit. But in reality, there's only 1 or 2 items that are very core to the unit that they're trying to play around. And the others are just luxury. We say it in TFT as like a +1. +1 means the 3rd item doesn't really matter as much as long as it fits like a general category that's good for it. So in this example of the current state of TFT, this is a Ginsu's Rage Blade. This is a Kraken, which is a bow and a cloak. This is bow rod. This is bow cloak. And this is bow sword. But in reality, for a lot of carries right now, maybe instead you just want Rage Blade and this Kraken. So that would mean that you need 2 blows and 1 cloak. However, the bait is thinking that you actually need multiple rods. And we talked about this before, that you don't really want things like a lot of rods in a lot of physical damage comps. So instead, you want to be thinking about components that you would priority take. If you want other utility items, like an Even Shroud and a Sunfire, you're actually looking for more things like cloaks, plural. You're looking for things like belts, plural. And you only want 1 rod, 1 sword, and 1 vest. This is a lot to take in. So if this is kind of going too advanced for some of you guys, slow down, maybe even skip this part because it might be too confusing. But the idea is, in your mind, you should be thinking when you're going on the carousel, what is my item prioritization? And the carousel priority in this case is a bow, which is better than a cloak because you ultimately want multiple cloaks, versus a belt. And then you take a sword and a vest, and you're not really trying to take a rod unless it's absolutely core and you don't have a rod already, right? Because a lot of times you're going to be having a Rage Blade already slammed when you're playing something like this. So how do you find out what the most important prioritization is? A lot of people are saying, well, yeah, okay, I hear what you're saying, but how do I know where the core items slam versus things that are kind of a luxury? The first is a pretty obvious one. I'm a little bit biased. TFTAcademy.com will often tell you what the core item priority is. It's literally written, here's an example from the current set, an item priority list of what the components are, and also what are some of the core items. This is an example of Rage Blade and Kraken from the previous set. This might be long outdated by the time you see this video, but hopefully it's still applicable. TFTAcademy.com, best website in the world. The second is a stats website, and as you continue to improve, you'll see more and more how to use stats correctly. And yes, there is going to be a video in the future of me talking to you about how to use stats websites. But that's going to be at an intermediate/advanced level. Right now, we're going over the fundamentals. And these are the 2 that I would suggest, Meta TFT and Tactics tools. I use both. Another one that I think is really underrated is just the match history of good players. You draw common denominators on what they're building every single game. People stop doing this. It's actually kind of a dying art, but just look at what the best players are doing, and the match history is public. And for you to look, just simply click top of the leaderboard, look at how they're playing the most commonly played 4-cost composition, and say, wow, every game they have these items. Every game they have these tanks setups, things on so forth. And then the last thing is also something that you're already doing, which is watch high-level players, aka myself, or somebody else, it's okay, and how they prioritize the items. And if you don't even want to do that, let's say like, I don't want to read guides, I don't want stats, I don't want to look at match history players, I am one lazy bum, then if you're playing TFT, at the very least, look at the boards of someone who is beating you. Just look at the boards of someone who 5-streaked at the stage 2. They won 2-1, 2-3, 2-4, 2-5, 2-6, 2-7. And then you're saying, okay, what are they doing and why is it strong? If you just look at enough boards and you're saying, okay, I see this board winning with this augment, this item slam combination, you'll realize that these items are more important than others. All right, and the last major thing that we'll cover for today is the hidden item formula. The answer to a lot of questions when it comes to optimization in items for TFT is math. And the formula looks really complicated. If you actually look at the formulas, there's somebody that broke it down. This is a guy named Goofy. He actually sat down and said like, oh, it's like post mitigation, which is damage after resistances and stuff like that. Physical damage times this, blah, blah, blah. But what if you don't want to do math? You know, I'm a guy that plays TFT pretty intuitively, and I just don't want to sit there typing on my calculators to think about what is the actual optimization for, you know, things. I'm not a spreadsheet guy when it comes to this kind of stuff. Some people are, bless your heart, more power to you. But I don't like to do the math. I just want to follow a general set of rules. All you need to do is just remember this formula I'm about to show you. The hidden item formula is this. You have a base stat on every champion that they want. And then from there, you take 3 categories of multipliers. So for a tank, you have a lot of health, right? You just want health and you want shields and you want whatever. Multiplier number 1 that you want to add to the tank is, well, just more HP. That's totally fine. There's usually nothing wrong with adding more health, especially if they are a health tank. They usually want more health. It's pretty straightforward. The second multiplier are resistances. Going back to what we talked about before, it's important to penetrate resistances. It's also important to gain resistances. And the last is called durability, or they might say damage reduction. We call this DR for shorthand. You might see people write it as DR, but it's just a way to say just reduce damage by 10%, 8%, 20%. Okay, it's usually not going to be 20%. That's too high, but durability is also a multiplier. For physical and magic damage, they're basically the same thing. They only differ on one thing, which is their multiplier number 1. They have their base damage. For physical damage, you care about attack speed, crit, and damage amp. And for magic damage, you care about your cast rate, crit, and damage amp. Okay, one more time. Attack speed is good for physical because physical damage dealers are attacking before they also cast their ability. And so the amount of time they attack also does physical damage. And then if they crit, that's a multiplier you get on top of it, and then their damage amp. But if you're a mage, right? If you're some kind of wizard, you care about how often you're able to cast your ability. When you physically attack as a mage, you don't really do that much damage. A lot of times their AD is quite low, but your DPS is often measured by how fast you're casting. And so a lot of times it's going to be like a mana item of some sort, some kind of crit, and some kind of damage or, you know, AP base ability damage. Now the TLDR of that is just basically get 1 from each column. That's all you really care about. In terms of itemization, just 1 from each column because they multiply off each other. If you have health item, and you get more health item, it's just health plus health. It's not health times health. It's not like you get 100 HP and then you get 100 HP and then you have 10,000 HP. You get 200 HP. I told you I'm not a math guy. So just get 3 multipliers from each column and make sure that they all mix and match the stats correctly. I do want to add one caveat. If ability cannot crit, the crit only adds to your auto attacks. And so if you have a lot of crit but no infinity edge on your physical damage carry, when they cast their ability, they're not going to crit. If you have a mage, same thing. If you have a bunch of crit items, a bunch of glove items, but you have no jewel gauntlet or no augment that lets you do it, you're not going to crit. So it's actually a wasted stat. And that's going to be something more for the intermediate and advanced video. How do I know which multiplier to prioritize? Well, the main thing is to look at each stat that a unit wants and search for a complementary. I mentioned that there's, you know, health that wants resistances and damage reduction, but sometimes the ability of a unit gives you damage reduction or durability. And so you're going to prioritize health and resistances. So this is example 1, HP tank with resistances, do well with HP and durability. I have Wukong as an example here. And I want to also highlight the different icons that TFT has done to show you the type of scaling that they have. Wukong, this green heart means that more HP makes this number bigger. So Wukong scales off of health. This blue fireball means that ability power, or AP, scales this. So the more AP Wukong gets, he also gets more armor. So AP is almost like resistances in a way. And then AD scales his actual damage because he's an attack tank, as it says in here. So if you add more AD onto Wukong, he actually just does more damage as a tank, and every unit's going to deal damage, mostly in TFT. Example 2, AS carry is going to want more AS, AD, and damage amp. You get the idea. However, these rules often get broken because, well, Riot just wants to make TFT interesting. If every unit was itemized in the exact same way, I think the game would get boring pretty quickly. So these are, again, just the fundamental building blocks. It is going to change a lot of times. You're going to be thinking, why is it correct to go 3 Rage Blades on a carry? Well, it's probably because Riot had an oversight and made attack speed scaling way too good. So for this patch specifically, maybe it's correct to build 3 Rage Blades on a carry. Or maybe they just want to have that power fantasy. Not going to happen very often, but it will happen enough on an exception basis that you're going to realize it happens all the time. You also want items that synergize together. This is a little bit of a preview of a more intermediate and advanced concept for items, but you want items that synergize. And the big thing to really remember is that you want items that play off of their components pretty well. So for example, if you're playing a crit build, you want to maximize the amount of critical strike. So things like a Jewel Gauntlet and a Striker's Flail is very good because Striker's Flail gives a lot of base crit because it uses a glove component. That glove gives more crit to the Jewel Gauntlet. You want your crits to actually land. If you have a crit 50% of the time, that means 50% of the time you're doing your max DPS. So you want to max that crit. Versus if you're trying to play like a high frequency magic caster designed to take down tanks quickly, you want your items to kind of synergize with what your kit is actually doing. And the last example is something that I just showed. If your ability cannot critically strike, then these crit items, like currently a Gnasher's Tooth and a Striker's Flail, are going to be wasted stats. Again, that's much more of a advanced concept about having your items synergized. We'll talk about it in a future video, but I just wanted to show you some visualization of sets that currently work together really well. To make things even more confusing, each item has a subtype that also increases its use cases. And it's actually a really big part of skill expression in TFT. But we're not going to actually cover it all today. I just want to show you guys the chart so that way when I show it to you in the future, it's not going to completely overwhelm and show you. So if you're not interested in this part, just skip it. But I want to show you what it's like at a more advanced level. The item subtypes are based on what unit you're putting it on and what category it is. So for tanks, there's basically 3 types of tank items. There's true tank items that give you pure resistances or durability or other things like that to give you actual effective HP. The other is, quote, an off tank or a drain tank. You can tank by healing a lot. This is like the melee carry. I use Warwick as an iconic example from TFT. Warwick usually attacks and gains life back, life stealing, right? We call it Omnivamp. And he can take damage and heal it back. That's called off tanking or drain tanking. And then the last is support tank. Maybe their job is just to stun a unit. Maybe their job is to just shield before the thing happens. Maybe their job is to try and disable or cast like a mana slow. We call it mana reaving, where they can't cast their abilities. You would do like a tank utility item on them. For carries, there's front-loaded and back-loaded. This is pretty intuitive. Something that's burst-oriented versus like the longer the fight goes on, you scale. There's also flat stats and crits, which are 2 different categories you want to mix. There's utility of flat penetration versus percentage penetration. There's also anti-heal. There's not many shield and support items currently in the game anymore. Riot's actually taken most of that out, but there's still a few. And then there's also special items, artifacts, radiance, emblems, and augments type items, which, seriously, you don't actually remember all this. You actually will naturally learn this as you play, so don't feel too intimidated by all the categories. It's just something I want to put in your brain for the future. We're almost done, so let's go ahead and talk about some bonus fundamentals that I felt like is worth dipping into, because a lot of things that, you know, my chat is talking about as I'm doing this video versus other people that would teach you is that it's hard not to teach other concepts when you're discussing the basics in TFT. You're so tempted to talk about advanced concepts the moment you introduce the basics. So I want to do some bonus fundamentals. Oftentimes, when you're first starting out your items at the beginning of the game, you really want to focus on your offensive items. This one's actually kind of intuitive for a lot of people. They feel like they always want to prioritize their carry because dealing damage is how you think you win the game a lot of times. But this is mainly because offensive items are more specific, while tank items are pretty generic. Every tank basically wants health, resistance, and damage reduction, and you can replace them in a multitude of ways. Currently in TFT, if you have something like Steadfast Heart versus Spirit Visage, these are both durability items. They're pretty interchangeable, and they use different components, which is really nice. So that way, it feels like you're not screwed if you get dropped one specific type of item. And same thing with these types of items like Adaptive Helm versus Stone Plate. They both give resistances currently. But carry items tend to be sharper. They need to have specific specialization in order to get maximum value. And the name of the game for the carries is how effective they fit within your composition. And that changes based on your traits, based on your augments. And so the items tend to require more specificity. And that's why a lot of times you focus on your offense over defense. But at the same time, if you focus on tank items at the beginning of the game, you're more flexible. So you can pretty much choose whatever type of damage you want to do later in the game. If a composition has flexible itemization, it's usually better from win streak because you don't care about what items you get off the carousel. You don't really get to mix and match very much. And so if you have specific itemization, it's better to lose streak. The opposite of this is also true. Also, if you survive long in the game, you'll see more items to get BIS. If you don't get BIS now, you can always get BIS later. That's one thing that I want to emphasize if you're around like an Emerald Diamond player trying to push the Masters. A lot of times you look at the match histories of top players and you think, how do they always have the perfect items or close to it? It's because they survive long enough in the game to get those items. And a couple more bonus ones. What about Thieves' Gloves? Thieves' Gloves is quite a unique exception to a lot of itemization rules. It's hard to actually dive into Thieves' Gloves without actually going into some math, but here's a summary of what I can say about Thieves' Gloves right now. One, it's better on melee units than range units because of the way melee units are often scaled. Two, it's often simultaneously counted as a tank and a carry item, but it's also not. If you're thinking about you need an extra tank and you have a Thieves' Gloves on another unit, that's kind of like half of a tank. It's not really a carry, but it's also kind of a carry. It also drains from your item economy, so you have to be really careful. If you have 2 gloves that you build into a Thieves' Gloves, that's going to be 2 fewer item components you can have for 3 item tank, 3 item on your carry. Once again, remember you want 3 items on your tank, 3 items on your carry. You build a Thieves' Gloves, you're likely going to have a missing item on one of your units, one of your core units, by the time everyone's spiking and trying to roll their gold for their actual composition. So that's a really big trade-off you have to make, which is why Thieves' Gloves is often not an item that people make, but they'll take for free off of something like an item augment. But the other extreme about Thieves' Gloves that's really interesting is critical mass theory, which is if you just have enough items, you just have too much raw stats to deal with. So at the other end of the spectrum is if every one of your composition has a Thieves' Gloves, you probably win a lot of fights because you just have a lot of higher elevated stats across the board. And this is probably the most advanced concept I'll talk about, but we'll save it for a future video, which is the idea of component value. Every item in the game could be broken down into how many value of components you're getting off of that individual item. And for now, I just want to tell you the answer instead of break it down granularly and explore different ideas. The first is that artifacts and radiant items they're usually case by case, depending on their specific situations and use cases. But they tend to be worth around 6 or 7 components of which is worth about 1 to 0.5 or 2 times a normal item. So just remember that. Emblems are usually worth around 4 and 5 components, but that's because emblems have a hidden value, which they activate a trait, which can give you more stats. If emblems give you a trait that also adds 20 AP, that's worth also components as well. And so this is how Riot usually tries to balance around the idea of component value. But we'll talk about that in the future video. I just want to put that in your brain. All right, we're finally at the end of the video. This ended up being way longer than I wanted to be, but hopefully you guys learned a thing or two. So how do we apply some of these ideas? The first is slam items instead of greeting. Stop greeting your components. Put them in play so that they're in play. If you wait 5 rounds and you lose 10, 15, 20 HP, or it's worth a lot of gold, don't do that. You're going to, on average, be behind, and you only got marginally stronger anyways, unless it's absolutely core biz to the composition you're playing. 2 is 1 item augment every game is generally a good thing. If you have no item augment, there's actually a pretty good chance you don't actually have a fully itemized duo carry until the end of stage 5. That's because at the end of stage 5, you'll have a full item from the stage 5 carousel and the full item at the end of stage 5. And that's a really long time. Usually the game is decided by then. At the end of stage 5, usually there's only a few people left alive. And so if you don't have a duo carry by then, you're just going to be playing from behind. So if you're not taking item augments, try to take at least 1 a game. You don't want to only keep taking offensive components. This is tying back to item economy. If you only take swords, rods, tears, and bows, because Frodan said focus on your offense early, and then more of them drop during the PvE rounds, you're just going to have no tank items. So it's okay to start planning for your tank items as well as your offensive items. If you have 4 offensive items, try not to just full greed more offensive items, because then you're just going to end up 2 item tank, going back against our golden rule, 3 item tanks, 3 item carry. Double component items are too expensive because of item econ. It's far harder to get something like blue buff than Shojin and Void Staff. This is another concept we'll talk about in a future video, but The idea is, yes, blue buff might be better than Shojin for specific carry, but if you have Shojin, you can make Void Staff, you will win fights, you preserve more HP, and you'll realize it's not that much better anyways. So you can just commit to having these split up components, which is why a lot of times when you look at stats and other guides, there's some impractical stuff. If something says you want 4 rods on a carry, that's just not going to happen very often without an augment. I already said this, but plan ahead on carousels. Create a prior lists, ideally A, then B, then C. Then when your first preference is taken, take a component that's flexible. So an example, a glove in full crit builds. You can build these offensive items that you want, or you can turn into a tank item right now like Steadfast Heart, which is glove and a vest. All right, and that's it. I ended up making this video probably twice as long as I wanted to, but I think items are very important and also complex at a baseline level that ties into a bunch of intermediate and advanced concepts. So I hope you learned a thing or two. But if you are looking for more content, whether it's fundamentals about econ or other guides or things like that, check out some of these channels. And the next time I'm going to be doing this talk, we're going to be covering augments and how to select good augments, how to evaluate if you made the right augment choice, and perhaps most importantly, how augments will set up things like your line selection, aka your meta read. All right, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you guys next time. Like and subscribe. Peace.